Sorry, this nearly there.
So welcome to Princeton TV. We have with us a very special guest today, historian William Dalrymple.
Sorry, forgive me.
Who lives in Delhi and London and lately Kabul?
No, I'm basically based in Delhi.
Right.
My second job is a goat farmer in in Meroli. So no, Delhi, I'm there 10 months a year.
So the U.S. is pulling out of the Afghan war, the longest war in U.S. history.
Correct.
Earlier than planned. The plan was to exit by 2014. They're exiting a year earlier. And so could you comment on this, given the book is quite timely in terms of
Well,
US strategy?
I should say, first of all, that my speciality is 19th century Afghanistan, not 21st century Afghanistan, but obviously I've been back and forwards a fair bit and written a fair amount about it too.
Right.
Well, from my perspective, what's interesting is that the degree to which this is replaying history.
Right.
In 1839, the British went into Afghanistan on a really unnecessary war that was the result of a small group of ideologically driven hawks using a piece of intelligence and manipulating it in order to have a war that they had already decided upon.
Right. It's the first Afghan
Well, yeah, this is the first Afghan war, and in a sense more like Iraq than like the way the weapons of mass destruction were manipulated in order to
This is
create.
the beginning of the Great Game, as you say in the book.
This is the very beginning of the Great Game. This is a period when Britain is beginning to gobble up South Asia, when the Russians are gobbling up Central Asia, and the two are clearly going to meet in the middle somewhere.
Right.
And the British spies and Russian spies are kind of skirting around each other in the Hindu Kush. And while it may have been a game, obviously, for the young British and Russian officers engaged in sort of gung-ho acts of espionage in the high passes, it was very far from a great game for the Afghans and the other peoples of Central Asia who were conquered, subjugated, and in many cases massacred. And this war that the British embarked on in 1839 is the great disaster of imperial history. 18,500 men went in. One man came out 2 years later.
You have a personal connection, though. I think you said in a talk your great-great-granduncle
was one of the very.
Mackenzie.
He
was taken hostage.
He was taken hostage. So
but he's one of the persons who survives.
There are quite a lot of people who are taken hostage and eventually exchanged. But but in terms of the retreat from Kabul, only one man makes it through. My great uncle was not among them, in that he was imprisoned in Kabul.
Right. And but he lives on to.
He lives on to tell the tale.
Battalion.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
This is, for Britain, this is the great story of imperial humiliation. At the peak of the empire, with Britain controlling more of the world economy than it's ever done before or after, you suddenly have this moment when there is a complete and utter defeat. And what's interesting is that for a start, the man we put on, Shah Shuja, is the direct tribal predecessor of Hamid Karzai. They are both the chief of the Popalzai tribe. Likewise, the guys who bring down Shah Shuja in 1842 are the Ghilzai tribe. The Ghilzais are now the foot soldiers of the Taliban. And even the microgeographies of the occupation today reflect exactly that of 1839. If you go to Kandahar, there's a bridge over the Arghandab River, which is the boundary between, if you like, the occupied and the resistance. Today, it was in 1839, it is again 1842. So you have the same groups of people, the same occupying forces, speaking the same language, being sniped at from the same hills, and it's in a sense the same tribal configurations with slightly different
So in terms of
flags.
personal connection, did you grow up knowing about your great-great-granduncle? No. Or was it something you discovered while you were doing the research?
It turns out that huge numbers of my family, unable to make a living in Scotland, got packed off to the colonies over about 300 years. And I've been able to mine them for books and stuff ever since. But it wasn't actually part of my childhood at all. This was something which I discovered only when I got to India.
So the U.S. strategy and the strategists would claim that they had been successful in beating back Al-Qaeda Central. This is the official.
Well, I think that's not an unfair claim. I think everyone agrees that Al-Qaeda Central is shattered irreparably.
Right.
But the trouble is that obviously the Taliban isn't shattered.
But you said
and the Taliban isn't shattered, and more importantly, Pakistan has been completely and radically destabilized by the war in Afghanistan. I think that's one thing the Americans and the Pakistanis can both agree on.
Okay.
And so there is a question whether we've just, in a sense, shunted the problem to one side. But if you take the view that the whole point of being in Afghanistan was only to sort out Al-Qaeda, then in that sense you could probably say there's been some success. But if you try to make the wider claim, which I think is certainly true, that America was actually there to try and bring peace and stability to the region, to try and introduce democracy and put balm on a lurid wound.
Right.
That hasn't been successful.
Okay.
The reality is that the Taliban controls 70% of the south, and that when the Americans pull out, it's not going to get any easier. We're going to see an extremely unstable and dangerous situation for the next few years.
But in speaking with several, people who are inside, I've also learned that the U.S. is leaving, but they're not leaving.
Yes, I mean,
So how do you
there is 130,000 troops in the country at the moment. There will be 30,000 next year. So if you like, they're pulling out 3/4, leaving in a quarter.
Right.
Which I think is, having created this situation, I think it would be immoral and strategically foolish to pull out completely. I think in a sense that's a sensible decision.
Right.
The sadness is that so many opportunities have been lost over the last 12 years. When the US went in 2001, the Taliban were deeply unpopular, and America had the sympathy of the world. The reality is that thanks to Iraq, thanks to staying in too long, thanks to not building enough roads, schools and hospitals and showing enough goodwill, and only concentrating on security in its narrowest definition, I think America scored a terrible own goal, that they let down their own goals. And today, had they played their cards more sensibly, that we could be in a much more, we'd be in a much better position, frankly.
So let me shift a little bit to the Asian pivot. The U.S. has announced a bigger strategy for Asia. The region that you cover is kind of central to what the State Department calls, and Hillary Clinton, President Obama calls, the pivot towards Asia Pacific.
We have Bernard Rubin sitting 100 yards away, who's part of that strategy.
Right. So how do you think the strategy is going to play out?
Well, at this very moment, there are discussions going on between India and China about the future of Afghanistan. There have been discussions between Pakistan and Afghanistan last month. Everyone is waiting to see what happens. It's a huge change. Not only does the US pull out next year, but Karzai steps down. He is constitutionally, he's had the end of his 2 terms. He can't stand again. So it's a huge moment, and I don't think anyone's particularly optimistic that we're going to see Afghanistan instantly transformed into Switzerland next year. It's going to be another period of instability. It's not completely hopeless. Among the many sort of olive branches or like little shoots of hope that are out there is the fact that the Chinese are investing very heavily in Afghanistan. Now, if the Chinese really do build the roads and have buy up the rare earths, the copper and the lithium that they need for their programs, they perhaps could put pressure on Pakistan to restrict
so
the Taliban.
Still central to, you would say, the strategy, given Pakistan is involved, China is involved.
I think everyone, including Pakistan, is anxious that Afghanistan will turn into a major centre of regional instability. I don't think anyone, even Pakistan, wants it to return to where we were in 2001 January with the Arab Al-Qaeda effectively taking over control of the Taliban government. And things like the Bamyan Buddhas, the training camps, no one, least of, and I think, oddly, this is something which, one of the very few subjects that India, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and the US can all agree on. Everyone would fear that outcome. Pakistan itself has, Kayani has declared that the number one threat is now domestic terrorism, and so there is reason to hope that the Pakistanis are finally falling out of love with their old strategy of, how far and how much of Pakistan, because Pakistan is such a fractured polity anyway.
So talk briefly about the trilogy that you mentioned earlier. This is the completion of the trilogy for you, right?
Correct. I should say that, my day job is writing histories of the 19th century. We've been talking largely about the 21st century, which is almost a hobby in a sense rather than my main
because of the
expertise.
direct parallels.
But I've written 3 books on the history of the East India Company and India between 1800 and 1850. This is a crucial turning point. The weird fact of imperial history is that India is not actually conquered by the British government. It's conquered by a public limited company. The East India Company is an incredibly sinister object, which is a public limited company with shareholders, with annual general meetings, with dividends, all the things a company normally has. But it also has the largest standing army in Europe. It has the largest standing army in Asia.
At the time, yeah.
And there's no modern equivalent. The modern equivalent would be Microsoft with nuclear submarines, or PepsiCo with jet fighters or something. And it is a company which conquers India. And I think this is such an extraordinary book of history that I've written a trilogy about the changing relations. And what's interesting again is that the early period of the East India Company goes quite against our usual preconceptions of what it means to be a British imperialist. In the early days, a third of all the Brits in India were married to Indian women. You have a huge number of mixed households. The British are commissioning Indian miniatures, writing Urdu poetry, writing Persian poetry. This is the White Moguls. This is the first volume. The last volume, volume 3, is the story of how that all comes to an end in the Great Indian Mutiny, which is what the British call it, the First War of Independence, what India calls it. 1857, the largest anti-colonial uprising ever to take place anywhere in the world, breaks out in Meerut, travels to Delhi, and very nearly knocks the East India Company out of the picture. It's absolutely hanging on a thread. And when the British do eventually win the struggle, due to the lack of logistical expertise, really, it's a lack of organisation on the part of the rebels and coordination that does them in. The British engage in the most horrific war crimes ever to take place anywhere in the empire. And people today remember Jallianwala Bagh, where 300 Indians are killed in Amritsar. This is on a scale hugely greater than that. This is absolutely hundreds of thousands of people are killed, and no, I think the whole thing is one of the most sort of shaming and desperate moments in the history of colonialism. So this volume is the middle. Right. This is 1842. This is the moment, exactly, and it is many of the sepoys who are in Afghanistan, who are enslaved or captured or are left by their officers, deserted on the retreat, who then go back and break into mutiny a few years later.
Shifting to Afghanistan, FT says that as foreign troops prepare to leave, the Afghans are really worried that there will be a usurpation of power by the Taliban significantly. And everybody's sort of afraid of 2014, and other papers like the Gulf News, New York Times are reporting that potentially there will be a civil war breaking out. Now you seem to suggest that clearly at the end of your book. Well,
yes, I mean everyone is agreed that this is an extremely pivotal and crucial moment. There are two things only really that can happen, I think, because the reality is the Taliban not only could take over, they are already in control of 70% of the rural south. Right. That's the reality we have, even with 130,000 American troops in the country. Right. So there's only two possibilities. One is that there could be some form of reconciliation, and there's lots of negotiations going on, both openly and covertly at the moment in places ranging from Chequers with the British Prime Minister through to meetings in Qatar and more shady meetings elsewhere in the region. And it's not impossible. Some sort of power-sharing arrangement could be cobbled together, particularly if China, as I say, puts its boot in. But the Afghan history would tend to lead to the supposition that things are not going to end well.
Right. So the graveyard of empire sort of cliche still lives on, if you will.
Well, I don't believe that it's impossible to conquer Afghanistan. If you know the medieval history, the Timurids, the Mongols, the Mughals all successfully ruled Afghanistan. But what it is it's a drain on resources. Every empire that comes in has to, it doesn't produce anything, and you just spend fortunes and hundreds of young men's lives policing this area. And in the end, what happens is that most empires, in the end, conclude it's simply not worth it. Right. So you get Russia pulls out, and America hasn't been.
So I interviewed a former CI officer who just came back 2 weeks ago from the Valley. He was there for the U.S. government. He's writing a report, of course. Now, he narrated a very similar interview with one of the warlords, and he said, it's not that the Russians lost, it's that they just ran out of money.
Yeah, I think this is the key point in understanding intervention in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a country, according to the ruler Dost Muhammad Khan, which is a country of stones and men. And he asked the British, why have you come?
Yeah.
And the answer is that in all cases, these different forces grab Afghanistan for strategic reasons. It looks good to control it on a map, but the reality is it's difficult to hold, and it's expensive to hold. To garrison it, you have to put troops in every valley, on every hilltop, and most countries simply can't afford this.
It hasn't conquered before, though, I think you said in your talk.
Yeah, it's a myth that it's never been conquered. The Mongols held it, the Mughals held it, the Timurids held it. In fact, everyone has conquered Afghanistan. But all three of the Western powers who conquered it, Britain in 1839, the Russians in the late 70s, the Americans since 2001, they've all found it's simply not worth holding.
So the Western powers?
Well, I think you can count Russia as a Western power, as a European power.
Right,
yeah.
right.
Certainly for the nice of Afghanistan.
So does the graveyard of empires kind of cliche?
Well,
still hold?
Well, it is true and it's not true. It's not true that every empire has been defeated there, and it's not true that every empire collapsed. In fact, the British, after they lost Afghanistan in 1839, went on to be stronger than ever. The British in 1839, having had their army destroyed on the retreat from Kabul, they then come in with an army of retribution, which lays waste to Afghanistan.
Right.
And following that, again, they're not defeated. They go and take over the Sindh. They go and take over the Punjab. So it's the idea that Afghanistan finished off the British Empire is clearly wrong. But it's also true that everyone in the end feels they can't hold Afghanistan. The British successfully held India. They held the Punjab. They held great areas of the world, but they got out of Afghanistan because such was the fighting strength of the people.
So what's the strategic importance, though, of the area?
Well, for each empire it's been slightly different. For the British in 1839, they wanted to keep the Russians out. This was the great game. There were two imperial powers competing for Afghanistan. For the Russians in the 1970s, it was the great international Marxist revolution and moving towards the warm water port. They always had their eye on Karachi, so it's said. And for the post-American, for the post-9/11 American conquest, it was obviously getting rid of Al Qaeda and replacing the Taliban, which they did do. And I mean, Al Qaeda isn't there, but they have greatly eroded Al Qaeda Central.
Right.
What they haven't done is destroy the Taliban. The Taliban have come back and they're stronger than ever.
Right. Now they're leaving, but they're not leaving, right? As well as this is the tagline that I hear from several.
Yeah, there are. I mean, the reality is that there are now, I think, something like 130,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. They're pulling out 100,000, leaving 30,000 in. But what the British did, which is interesting as a parallel, I mean, just to go through the parallels again calmly, the British put into power Shah Shuja-ul-Mulk, who was the grandson of Ahmad Shah Durrani. His direct descendant is Hamid Karzai. He is the new chief of the Populzai, just as Shah Shuja was in the 1830s.
Right.
The Shah Shuja was brought down by the Ghilzai tribe. The Ghilzai tribe today make up the foot soldiers of the Taliban.
Right.
So you have the same tribal battles taking place under slightly different flags in slightly different places.
Right. So the U.S. plan, is to invest a lot of money either through the IMF, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank.
No, this is exactly what the American plan has never been, and this is the catastrophe. The American plan has, since 2001, has always been to concentrate on security, and this is why the American occupation always failed, because they didn't build roads, they didn't build schools, they didn't build. No.
The recent plan is to invest on the.
Well, it's a bit late now. I mean, you've been in there 12 years, and when ordinary Afghans look at the country, they know that you've spent trillions. They say, where the hell is it? The answer is 70% comes back straight to America.
It's gone to the poppy fields and to the war.
No, it hasn't gone to the poppy fields. It has gone to American development. It has gone to American contractors, American security companies.
Right.
70% of all money spent in Afghanistan comes back to the US in terms of military
and
salary and so on.
It's gone into these McMansions. I mean, I hear people who come back.
No, that's not American money. It's gone into the mansions. That's the poppy. That's the profits of the poppy trade.
I see.
Which was facilitated effectively by the occupation. The Taliban banned the poppy trade initially, and once they got thrown out, they were able to. They changed their policy,
and there is
they survived on that. But it's not American money going directly into
so the
narco
charges
mansions.
of corruption that we hear in the U.S. certainly against Karzai.
The charges of corruption are very, very real indeed. But it's not that America is directly CIA money is directly facilitating opium production. It's more indirect than that. But there are linkages. It's certainly true that some of the people who America supports are also involved in the narco business.
The opium trade, of course, has gone up 3 times.
Correct.
In the last 3 years or so.
Absolutely, and it's all pouring into the West. So, I mean, the great tragedy of this is we have scored so many own goals there. In 2001, there was huge sympathy for America.
Right.
There was a huge hatred of the Taliban.
Right.
The opportunity to turn Afghanistan around was there, and if America had invested in roads, in schools, in hospitals, rather than just pouring all the money into security companies, we'd be in a very different situation
So
to where we are now.
talk about India's role now a little bit, given you spend a lot of time in India.
I live in it.
And right, part of your...
I spent 10 months here.
Oh, really? Okay. Oh, I thought you were spending quite a bit of time in England as well, and
No, I have a house in London which we go to for the summer, June, July.
Oh, okay.
But I basically live in Delhi.
based in Delhi.
All my stuff is there.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that. Okay, interesting. Wow, so that must be quite an experience for you. So how,
Well, I've
how
lived
do
there
you
20 years. That's kind of where I live.
20. So how do you see
25 years.
India, you know, this incredible India and India rising and all of that, and then you see sort of horrific sort of crime on women?
Well,
No,
crime
you
on
wrote- you wrote a
women,
piece
I mean,
on
we're
that.
sitting here in New York. It's not as if there's no rape taking
Yes.
place in New York. I think
Yes.
you can, certainly the rape goes on all over the world. There's some horrific crimes against
Right.
women in India.
Right.
And we've seen some particularly outrageous and disgusting examples reported in a drip feed over the last few months.
Yeah.
But I mean, tragically, this has always been going on in India. Certainly, as a man who had a wife and daughters living in India, we've always been very much aware this is an extremely dangerous place. It hasn't got worse; it's just suddenly being reported.
The
But it's
media-
also true, I think, that rape goes on tragically all over the world. I don't think it's as if suddenly if Indian men are kind of suddenly.
No, I'm not suggesting India is at the highest in terms of, it's not the rape capital.
Statistically,
quite
it's
yet.
not. Statistically, it's not. I think.
And the reporting of
yeah.
it has certainly heightened it.
I think this is what happens with international news networks. You have one particularly horrific story, and suddenly everyone reports it.
Right.
I mean,
The story was horrific, though.
the story was utterly
almost
horrific,
savage.
but it is savage. And since then, we've seen other disgusting examples
then,
of
yeah.
attacks on
Right.
even a girl 5 years old.
Right.
But this is not something that's new. This is something that's going on, and tragically, this is also something that happens in many other places in the world.
So,
East and West.
But it is the case that in India, though, that half of the population, namely women, do not necessarily have as strong a democratic voice.
I don't think that's true. I think
You don't think that's
I
true?
think you can argue the contrary, that India is one of the countries actually. I mean, I'm certainly in the middle class in Delhi. I've never seen such a henpecked society. All these incredibly strong Punjabi women
Right.
giving their men what for
the domestic sphere,
in a
though.
domestic sphere.
And now
no, but I mean, no, but
working as well now.
no, I think I mean, I strongly believe that. I mean, it's a big struggle for the women in many parts of the world. But India has a huge number of women MPs, women MLAs. Afghanistan has more women parliamentarians than the US Congress does.
So why is this up?
I think anyone that anyone that knows
media-
Eastern
Yeah.
women will know that the Afghan women and Indian women are incredibly
So you
strong.
think you're saying you're suggesting this is all media driven at this time?
There's no question at all that the focus on rape in Delhi
Yeah.
is something which the media have latched onto since that horrific thing.
Right.
The situation in Delhi is disgusting. Many women, I mean, all women find this a very un-women-friendly city, but this is not a new story. This is something which has been going on for 30, 40 years.
Okay.
It's also a story which takes place in other cities in India and in other places in the world.
Okay.
Rape is tragically something that goes on in many countries. And I think statistically, I don't think it's true that India has a much worse record than anywhere else. I think
No, but the laws
men,
are more lax, right? And
well, what is terrible is that the police are very, very bad at
and the
following
police
up on it.
enforcement is also
Yeah,
quite
no.
lax. Yeah.
But I think as so often with media stories, you can, in a sense, over-report something. And I think that I understand that tourism to India dropped by 30% last year because everyone thinks they're now going to get raped when they go to India. That emphatically is not the case. There is a problem with rape in India. Tragically, that's true of many cities in the world. I mean, I'm not just saying this to try and sort of...
I would say even Indian Americans who
yeah.
were from India were quite taken aback by these.
But I think what was horrific was the savagery
Yeah.
and the horror of that attack. And that attack was unbelievably brutal. But
So future within the Asian pivot, I know we touched on it very briefly yesterday. How do you see this playing out, given this is sort of the epicenter of Al-Qaeda?
I think it's very important to try and understand Afghanistan in a regional context.
Right.
Often, I think the West looks at it as a struggle between fundamentalist Islam and America, between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda on one hand and the US on the other. The reality is that it's a regional conflict. The Pakistanis support the Taliban because they're terrified about Indian influence in Afghanistan. India is the forgotten element, or the forgotten corner in this triangle, if you like.
Right.
I've been told always by my British diplomat friends in Islamabad that Kayani will talk about nothing at the moment except India and Afghanistan. He's obsessed with Indian plots in Afghanistan, that the Secret Service RAW is sending insurgents down to Balochistan. And this is something he literally obsesses about. This is what he's briefed about, this is what he's worrying about.
Okay.
And I think you've got to see it within the context with India. you've got to see it also in the context of China. China has bought up huge quantities of mineral rights all over Afghanistan,
Right.
and in a sense, one of the hopes for peace is that China will hold down by investing hugely in minerals, in communications, in rail and road networks, that they will be able to succeed where we've all failed in keeping the Pakistanis and the Taliban in place. Because Pakistan depends on Chinese support, and they won't fall out with China.
Right.
It's a very crucial element in the
So
story.
Americans are leaving, though, like we said.
Well, America is leaving in part. There are about 125,000 troops in America now. They will leave only 25 to 30,000. We don't know the exact number, which is a small force. Certainly, though, it's probably about equal to the size of the Taliban. There are no more than 25 to 30,000 Taliban. There are no accurate figures, of course, and they come and go. But and many of it's sort of amateurs taking a pot shot, coming over the border or whatever.
Well, that's what my informants as well, the CSA, have not been able to make any kind of a big dent.
To compare with that, there were probably around 300,000 Mujahideen fighting the Soviets. There are about 25,000 Taliban only. I think America has been able to, and the international community have been able to create a much wider Afghan coalition than the Soviets managed. There was only a very small number of pro-Soviets in Kabul, but there's this wide coalition. For example, all the Northerners who were fighting the Russians are very, very much behind behind ISAF in America.
Right. So is there some semblance of an Afghan civil society now?
That's a very important question, and it's true.
You quote Adam Mirza from 170 years ago. Is there another,
No, there is, and this has been.
like
The failure of the West in Afghanistan was that they didn't build the hospitals, the schools, and the roads.
Right.
But almost despite that, having created a space for democratic government, Afghans have themselves seized the opportunities. Kabul has tripled in size since, I think even quadrupled in size since 2001. Jalalabad and Kandahar similarly. Even provincial towns like Farah are much bigger. And the younger generation are wired, they're on the internet, they're reading all the newspapers, seeing all the shows. And it's very difficult to imagine that world succumbing to the Taliban again. It's just, the Taliban remain a rural southern phenomena.
Right.
And I think while they can create a great deal of disruption and a great deal of violence, particularly if they're backed and armed, they cannot overrun the country in the way that they did in the late 80s.
And of course, they're at the negotiating table, right, in Doha and elsewhere with US and
Well, it comes and goes. They, I think, are prepared to negotiate. Karzai can't make up his mind whether he's willing to negotiate, whether he's willing to negotiate directly, which is what he wants, or whether through the Americans. So the whole thing is, is in an uneasy and unsettled place. But I think it's possible to imagine negotiations which were unlikely 5 years ago.
Now, in the book, you say that this battle, the first battle for Afghanistan, is Afghanistan's Yorktown.
Correct.
Or England's Trafalgar.
Trafalgar, yeah.
Trafalgar. And then you reference non-violent movement in India, as in Gandhi's Salt March.
What I mean to say is that for the Afghans, they look back on this uprising of 1842 as their national liberation struggle. What Michael Collins was and the Easter Rising to the Irish, what Trafalgar or Waterloo was to the British, what Yorktown and Washington was to Americans, this is to the Afghans. Gandhi is perhaps a slightly less accurate comparison, because obviously he was non-violent, and this is very far from non-violent.
And given
but it does have the same place, just like you see Gandhi on every note, every rupee note in India. So Wazir Akbar Khan is remembered as the main diplomatic area in Kabul. They are the national heroes.